much, President Lagarde. Now we start our Q&A session, and we start with Ludwig Niedermayer for the EPP. You have 1.5 minutes for the question.
Thank you very much, Irene, and welcome, Madam President. Starting with inflation, as you rightly said, CPI is behind the peak, but core inflation is very concerning. Combined with the relatively positive outlook for the economy, we are still in the middle of inflation troubles. And as you rightly said, the risk is that inflation expectation can stick to too high level. I very much appreciate that your interest rate policy seems to be on the track, but I wonder what is the role of other policies that are within the public domain. So first of all, how you see the role of balance sheet reduction that you just highlight for the disinflation, and if there will be some discussion about quantitative policy role in monetary policy in the future. And also I would like to hear how you see the role of fiscal policy in current development. I won't also ask the question on banking, but let me stop now and I will use it in the second part.
Thank you very much, Mr. Niedermayer, for these questions. On the, I would like to just stress the fact that what we regard as the key policy tool in our determination to return inflation to 2% in the medium term is the interest rates. So what we are doing in terms of normalization of monetary policy at the moment is not the key instrument that we are using. So what we have decided at our February meeting is to define the modalities of reducing our asset purchase program holdings. And during the period of partial reinvestment, the Eurosystem will retain the existing smooth reinvestment approach. The monthly redemptions under the APP between March and the end of June 2023 will exceed the decided average runoff pace of 15 billion euros per month. Partial reinvestment in excess of 15 billion per month will ensure that the Eurosystem maintains a continuous market presence under the APP over this period. We will decide on the basis of our observations of the markets and our partial reinvestment policy at the end of June, and probably before that, in order to be in a position to revisit our decision in terms of volume and pace, what we do next. And we will determine whether we move from 15 billion per month to more or to less, but all of that is going to be data dependent. And as we have indicated in our most recent monetary policy decision, forward guidance is no longer one of the tools that we are using. However, for this partial reinvestment policy, we have indicated some forward guidance because it takes us until the end of June. But post-June, we will have to determine what happens going forward. On the, you asked me about fiscal policy. We could spend a lot of time actually on the theme of fiscal policy. I think what we have and what I have said repeatedly at the Eurogroup and what the Governing Council has indicated very clearly in the last two monetary policy statements is that it was now time for fiscal authorities to roll back the support that had been decided in order to support the population at large in most instances against the impact of the energy crisis. We have observed, despite the recommendations of having those fiscal support programs be temporary, targeted and tailored, that it was not necessarily the case, and that only probably about anywhere between 10 and 25% of those programs were actually labeled T, temporary, targeted and tailored. So our recommendations and our hope is that fiscal authorities will appreciate the necessity to proceed to a recalibration of the fiscal supports that had been decided, and that those programs will be focused on those who need it most and will be tailored in order to make sure that there is an incentive to reduce the consumption of energy. So that has been our position. And we are certainly, we have been flagging for the last two monetary policy governing council decisions that now it really was time to do so, because absent some such recalibration, the two policies, monetary on the one hand and fiscal policy, would be working at cross purposes and would risk pushing us into tightening more our monetary policy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I have nothing to add to this question, so let me go to the banking, and maybe just to say what is my impression that when talking about the reduction of quantitative measures, that mean your balance sheet reduction, it's now rather issue of financial stability than monetary policy, the speed. But on the banking, my view is that it's not entirely surprising that some banks are in difficult position, as it is combination of very long period of extremely low return and interest rate, as well with sharp, well-justified increase of interest rate now. So I wonder if we are now in very early stage, so we don't know what will happen then. But I wonder how strong for you is the relevance of this event to monetary policy, and if you would expect that in order to allow you to better operate the monetary policy, there should be some reflection of the risks that materialized, unfortunately, in case of some of the banks, by the regulators and supervisors. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your second question, Mr. Niedermayer. We could also spend a lot of time on that one, like the one on fiscal. But let me also repeat a point that I have made during the press conference after the monetary policy decision that we made last week. In my mind, and in the mind of the Governing Council, there is no trade-off between monetary policy on the one hand, between price stability on the one hand and financial stability on the other hand, okay? And for each of these two stabilities, we are using different tools. Price stability is the primary objective of the European Central Bank. But we all know that price stability goes with financial stability, and they are both important and come together. But there is no trade-off between the two. We will use the tools that we have in order to address price stability, and that's what we are doing. We are using the interest rates that we have, and this was the case last week, this was the case before, because we have enough ground to cover to move at the pace where we are moving. And as far as financial stability is concerned, we have all the tools that will be needed, that are needed eventually, in order to address financial stability tensions. So we have the standard operation. We have other tools that can be used. We have demonstrated that in the past, and those tools will be used if necessary. But I don't see a trade-off between the two. Now, of course, you know, financial stability, to the extent that it impacts the economic situation, to the extent that it impacts our projections, have an impact on how we see the situation from a macroeconomic point of view. But there are two different stabilities addressed by different tools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Jonas Fernandez for S&D.
Buenas tardes, Presidenta. Bienvenida.
Buenas tardes. Wait. Give me a chance.
Sí. Bueno, en primer lugar, darle la bienvenida, agradecerle su comparecencia. Indicaba en su intervención inicial y ahora a respuestas de mi colega Ludek algunas recomendaciones sobre la gestión de la política fiscal a los Estados miembros en el sentido de poder ayudar al BCE en alcanzar el objetivo de inflación. Y indicaba usted que la posición fiscal de los Estados debería ser más bien neutra y, por otra parte, hacía recomendaciones sobre la descomposición del gasto público, ¿no? Intentando reducir las ayudas a los grupos más perjudicados y avanzar en un phase-out, ¿no? de estas medidas de ayuda del último año. Mi pregunta va en línea de estas recomendaciones sobre política fiscal y va dirigida a los datos que estamos observando sobre evolución de los salarios y evolución de los márgenes empresariales. Los salarios hasta ahora no están internalizando la evolución de la inflación, no vemos efectos de segunda ronda muy pronunciados en los salarios y, sin embargo, el propio BCE y la Comisión Europea y otros observadores evalúan cómo los beneficios de las empresas están creciendo de una manera muy elevada. O más bien dicho, que el incremento de la inflación está repercutiendo fundamentalmente en los beneficios. Y me preguntaba si tendría usted alguna recomendación para los Estados miembros sobre cómo evitar ese incremento de los beneficios, podríamos decir, que pueden contribuir también o que están contribuyendo también a la espiral inflacionaria. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fernandez, for your questions and for focusing specifically on the two key factors, which are labor and capital, workers and corporate, salaries and margins. And as you will have noted in our latest monetary policy statement, we do specifically refer to the margins that have been generated in the corporate sector. And I have in my most recent comments in that respect indicated that it was desirable, in order to avoid the risk of spiraling inflation and potential second-round effect, that there be a good burden sharing in order to support this quasi-tax that is impacting factors of production and ultimately consumers. And in that respect, it is not obviously the ambit of a European central bank or any central bank to do that, because what we're concerned about is the second-round effect, is the risk of spiraling inflation, and our main objective is price stability. But it is for the economic actors to actually allocate this burden and to share it appropriately. We have, for the moment, identified in our monetary policy statement that corporate margins had, if not increased, at least be maintained, and that there are some sectors which have been particularly prone to this maintaining of the margins. You have in the 2 pages that I think were circulated to all of you an interesting graph which indicates in particular this phenomenon about margins. It should be the case that as demand dampens, that prices ultimately have to go down and that margins will be squeezed. But this is not something that we have observed most recently in many sectors, in particular those that were exposed to the consequences of the pent-up demand as a result of the recovery. And we cannot exclude either that in some sectors, more than just the passing through of cost has impacted margins on the way up. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. I will come back. Sí, muchas gracias por su respuesta. Le preguntaré después en la siguiente sesión sobre la inestabilidad en los mercados financieros, en la siguiente sesión. Pero sobre esta pregunta, sobre este tema, sobre el reparto de los costes entre inflación, entre salarios y beneficios, me sorprende que haga usted recomendaciones sobre el gasto público de los Estados, la necesidad de aislar o de reducir el scope de los beneficiarios de los apoyos públicos en estos meses para combatir la inflación y que, sin embargo, cuando hablamos de los beneficios no tenga usted ninguna recomendación que hacer. No sé si podría recomendar incrementar la competencia en los mercados o incrementar los impuestos sobre esos beneficios para ayudar a que la política fiscal acompañe a la política monetaria. Quiero decir, hay instrumentos encima de la mesa, hay una evidencia que ustedes reconocen y me sorprende que en este caso no hagan ninguna recomendación cuando sí la hacen sobre el comportamiento del gasto público. Gracias.
Well, thank you very much for the follow-up. I think that there are various tools that are available. You mentioned competitiveness, you mentioned tax, you mentioned, I would think also of improve competitiveness by more, how would I put it? More targeted review of concerted agreement and possible practices amongst some of the corporate players, which I think begs some specific attention on the part of the antitrust authorities and competitiveness commissions in countries where they investigate those sectors. I think our policy recommendation has not dealt with the tools that can be used by the fiscal authorities, but has dealt with the key principles. We have repeated temporary, we have repeated targeted, we have repeated tailored. And we have observed, as has the Commission, I think, that these three principles were not particularly well applied to the fiscal packages or the fiscal support measures that were granted. It's notable that the Eurogroup in particular, under the leadership of Pascal Donoghue, its president, has worked in good cooperation with the Commission to identify those countries or those measures that actually satisfy the three T's. And it's clearly the case that some countries have internalized those three T's, not many actually, but some of them have. And particularly those measures that are triggered by increase in energy prices and are triggered on the way down by lowering of energy prices, for instance. Or that those measures that were specifically identified with vulnerable population or people most exposed by the risk of energy prices. But in terms of which tools can be used, it's really for the fiscal authorities to decide which ones they will prefer to use, but they're there. You mentioned some of them. As a former antitrust lawyer, I can think of a few others, but it's definitely the case that the tools exist.
Thank you very much. Now for the Renew Group, I give the floor to Martin Hlaváček.
Děkuji. Paní předsedkyně, my tady mnoho let usilujeme, abychom konečně přestali... Paní předsedkyně, my tady mnoho let usilujeme, abychom konečně přestali dělat rozdíly mezi členskými státy. Aby v naší politice nehrál roli předěl mezi východem a západem, mezi severem a jihem. Ale já se už docela dlouhou dobu nemohu zbavit dojmu, že politika Evropské centrální banky slouží některé skupině států více a jiné skupině slouží méně. A myslím si, že je to velmi riskantní, zejména v dnešní době a s hrozbami, které máme na východě. Já chápu, že při rozhodování musíte vycházet z celkové statistiky, ale na druhou stranu za situace, kdy fungování vnitřního trhu nemáme dořešeno a kdy se ceny hodně odlišují, má takový přístup zcela jistě omezení. Na ideálně fungujícím vnitřním trhu by míra inflace v jednotlivých státech neměla být tak odlišná, jakou ji máme dnes. Ale my ten trh nemáme. A proto mám dvě otázky. Můžete nám prosím říct, co konkrétního děláte pro to, aby východní země, ať ty, které jsou v eurozóně, které bojují s vysokou inflací, jak je politika centrální banky podporuje a také jak podporuje centrální banky zemí, které jsou mimo eurozónu v jejich boji s inflací. A druhá otázka, jestli byste mohla zmínit, jestli máme některá další doplňující opatření, kterými bychom mohli doplnit ty, které provádíte, abychom mohli i tyto země pomoci. Děkuji.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hlaváček. It is a fact that within the euro area, there is a degree of heterogeneity and there are divergences in terms of prices. And there are countries where the inflation rate is way north of 15%, has exceeded 20% at the highest levels back in October. whereas in other countries it's in the 5 to 6%. So there is that divergence. But as a European Central Bank for the whole of the euro area, we work on the basis of aggregate numbers that bring together in an aggregate way all countries. And what we have to do, though, is to try to understand why there is that divergence, why we have such heterogeneity, and what we concluded on the basis of this analysis and the feedback that we're getting from all the national central banks from all countries that have equal voice in the Governing Council, is that first of all you had significant differences depending on the predominance of certain sectors of activity. And for instance, those countries that were strong on tourism, for instance, had for a period of time very high price pressures at the time of the beginning of the recovery. Another clear evidence of this heterogeneity results also from the proximity of trade with countries that are now under sanctions. And if you look up north on the map of the euro area, obviously the Baltic countries are directly affected by this proximity and the volume and dependence on trade with immediate neighbors. There's a third component which has also applied, which is limited fiscal support, which is decided at the country level. So limited fiscal support that has been extended by some of those countries that have the highest inflation numbers. But in the face of all that, as monetary policy authority for the whole of the euro area, I cannot distinguish, I cannot have a range of interest rates that would apply to the north, to the east, to the south. This is the monetary policy beauty, which is that it applies to the entire euro area, which is why we're very keen to see the outcome of the discussions between the member states on the proposition of the Commission concerning governance and what further progress will be made, if any, in that respect, so that at the fiscal level there is a better path and a better roadmap and a better framework within which they can operate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Rasmus Andresen for the Greens.
Thank you so much, President Lagarde. Good also to see you back in the parliament. Here I am, now you can see me as well. Let me start out by sharing a concern I think many of us are having. I think that the situation on the financial markets right now is alarming, and from our perspective, despite all differences also to the situation in the US, we can't be sure that the current developments in the banking sector aren't turning out to end up being much bigger than what we actually can see right now, with also a lot of effects for the real economy, like for example also through higher unemployment. So my question goes on the link between the current developments in the banking sector and your monetary decisions on the other side. Last Thursday, you, President Lagarde, delivered on your promise of another large interest rate hike at 50 basis points. And at the same time, the American and Swiss banking crisis also has effects on the global banking system by banks handing out less loans or at a more expensive rate at least. So these effects also have an economically comparable dimension to further significant tightening of monetary conditions. So having those two developments in mind, I would like to ask you if the current developments also in the banking sector are changing your analysis and expectation for the economic outlook in general, and if you think that a recession is more likely now with the newest developments we are experiencing on the banking sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson, for your question. Let me just give you the background of our decision on monetary policy last week. It was one of those Governing Council where we receive from staff their updated projections on the basis of their massive work. Unfortunately, that massive work had cut-off date in terms of periods of time during which they observed the economy and took stock of data and proceeded to the modelization and projections. And those cut-off dates were, for some of the items, either February the 15th or March the 1st. And obviously, it did not incorporate the impact of the financial tensions that we then observed, particularly as a result of the failure of Signature Bank, followed by Silicon Valley Bank, and let alone the Credit Suisse development, which we have observed over the last few days. So, as a result of that, and given the inflation, which is too high and has been for too long, and our determination to bring it down, we decided to deliver on our interest rate hikes of 50 basis points. But we did not repeat exactly the same commitment that we had before, where we indicated our determination to continue raising interest rates in a steady manner and so on and so forth. Because in the face of the uncertainty that we had, that is, not updated projection, no calibrated impact of the financial tensions that we had observed on the markets, it was clearly more proportionate and more sensible to not make further commitment and to declare two things. One, that we would be data dependent, and two, to indicate clearly our reaction function by flagging the three components that we would take into account in order to decide subsequent monetary policy decisions. So that's the background, okay? In the face of that, we obviously saw the same financial tensions that you have observed. We are monitoring those tensions very carefully. We do that on an international basis, of course, but we also do that in the euro area banking sector. And we do so from a euro area financial stability perspective, also looking at individual banks as part of the regular supervision of the ECB banking supervision. Needless to say that I work in close cooperation, but with appropriate respect for the various competences in the various areas of central banking on the one hand, supervision on the other hand. But we work closely and listen to the developments and the assessment of Chair Enria, who luckily will actually be with you tomorrow. So there are quite a lot of questions that have to do with the euro area banking sector that I'm sure you will be very keen to ask him and that he will indeed address. But we regularly assess banks' readiness to manage risk. Last year, we looked at their ability to manage interest rate and credit spread risks. We regularly conduct stress testing exercises, and the result of the next one, which is ongoing actually, will be published next July. And we publish information on the capital position and liquidity of the banks. And we are very confident that the capital and liquidity positions of the euro area bank are very satisfactory, with significant capital ratio and liquidity coverage ratio way in excess of requirements. So that has led us to reconfirm again, and I'm happy to repeat that in front of you as the ECON Commission of the European Parliament, that we believe that the euro area banking sector is resilient with strong capital and liquidity positions. And as I have said, and I'm happy to repeat as well, in any case, we stand ready with our policy toolkit to provide liquidity support to the euro area financial system. And if the tools that we have in the toolbox were not enough, I know that staff is capable of providing the adjustment or the recalibration that would be needed in order to address any liquidity risk that we would see developing. Thank you.
A quick follow-up because we are
very quick follow-up, but still thanks for the answer. I just would like to ask a bit more specifically into the issue on the funds rate. In the US, we could learn that like in the last week, there had been a 1.5% increase in the Fed's funds rate. And I would like to get a better understanding of your assessment on this, if this also would happen in the Eurozone, which actually impact would this have for your decision-making, your monetary decision-making?
I'm not sure I'm spot on with your questions, but what I know for sure is that there's no trade-off between price stability, financial stability. We use two different sets of instruments for each of the two. We are mindful of the two. Price stability is our primary objective, and we know that it is conditional upon financial stability, but we are not compromising on one because of the other. We address them with different sets of tools.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Gunnar Beck for ID.
Guten Tag, Frau Lagarde. Ich bin außerordentlich beglückt, dieses Mal meine Zufriedenheit mit Ihrer letzten Entscheidung ausdrücken zu können. Nicht? Um ehrlich zu sein, nach der Insolvenz von Silicon Valley in den USA und den Sorgen um Credit Suisse hatte ich nicht mehr mit der richtigen Entscheidung gerechnet, den Leitzins um 0,5 auf 3% anzuheben. Mit dieser Zinserhöhung haben Sie sich auch das erste Mal klar von dem Anti-Bundesbankkurs Ihres Vorgängers abgegrenzt. Doch sagten Sie ja selbst, Sie könnten für die nächste EZB-Sitzung nicht mit ähnlicher Zuversicht eine weitere 0,5% Leitzinserhöhung andeuten. Wie groß ist der Widerstand im Zentralrat gegen die letzte Leitzinserhöhung und wie viel Rückendeckung hatten Sie? Ich wäre Ihnen dankbar, wenn Sie vielleicht ein wenig mehr dazu sagen könnten. Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Mr. Beck. I'm disappointed that you doubted us in the first place, but I'm quite happy that you are no longer in doubt. And what I can assure you, and where you should not be in doubt, is that we are determined to return inflation to 2% in the medium term. And we will do so. Now, what we have done on the occasion of our last Governing Council meeting, which was very focused, very serious, brought most members together with a few exceptions, very minor group of 3 to 4, which were supporting the decision but not the calendar of the decision. What we have done compared with previous monetary policy statement is we have not indicated any kind of forward guidance. We have said two things. One, we will be data dependent. The data on the basis of which we make our decisions are hallowed with uncertainty at the moment, and we cannot possibly make a commitment on the basis of this halo of uncertainty around our projections. And two, which is really important, we flagged the three elements that we would use in order to determine in order to decide our reaction function. And those three elements are, number one, the assessment of inflation outlook on the basis of the economic and the financial data that will come in. Two is the development of underlying inflation. And three, the strength and effectiveness of our monetary policy transmission. So I think those are three components which experts and ECB watchers, for instance, as well as you, I'm sure, will really appreciate and understand and will guide us to determine our next moves. It cannot be predicated at this point in time what that next move will be. But what is certain is that we have more ground to cover on the basis of current baseline. But we have to be attentive to the developments and how they will affect any of these three components that I have mentioned. But ultimately, we have to return inflation back to 2% in the medium term. And please do not doubt that determination. It is there and strong. Thank you.